Hey guys, Grandmaster Hansen here once again, and in this video we're going to look at Game 3 of the World Championship between Magnus Carlsen and Sergey Karjakin. In Game 3, Magnus had white, and the question was what he's going to play. He ended up with e4, and he plays e4 and d4 regularly, so this should come as no surprise. I thought he's going to play it early on to test whatever preparation Karjakin and his team had in the Berlin or in e4. So it went as expected, e4, e5. Sergey plays e5 all the time, specifically the Berlin. So the next few moves should come as no surprise. Knight f6. We all expected this at some point. And now castle. And that was unexpected in some ways because Magnus has recently much preferred d3, keeping more pieces on the board, maybe less theoretical, which is called the anti-Berlin. But after castles, Sergey played knight e4, trying to enter the Berlin endgame, which happens after d4, knight d6, bishop c6, dc6, de5, knight f5. This is the Berlin endgame, and this is how Vladimir Kramnik won the World Championship against Garry Kasparov. But instead, after castles, knight e4, Magnus went for rook e1. Rook e1 doesn't have a great reputation as white, but the benefit is you have a chance of a slight advantage without risking anything. However, the drawing rate is really, really high at the Grandmaster level. So knight d6. So when we saw this on the board, I expected Magnus had something up his sleeve. Otherwise, you don't want to risk just drawing with white again. Knight takes e5. Bishop e7. All mainline theory. Bishop to f1. And now knight takes e5. So black has already traded off a pair of pieces. Still, it's just kind of a dry position. Castles, d4, and now Magnus played bishop f6, rook e2. This move caught both Peter and myself by surprise. I haven't seen rook e2 as far as I know. The real standard move is rook e1 here, and there's a couple ways this position goes. Sometimes just knight f5, and for example, if we saw c3 d5, this is bishop f4, playable for white. Very, very, very close to equal, and it's a bit too symmetrical for my liking. However, this is the normal course when you play this line. So Magnus played rook e2, and that move, like, everyone's trying to figure out what's the point. You're blocking your queen. It looks unnatural, but there are some situations where it could be useful. For example, after rook e8, knight c3. After rook takes e2, we were speculating that maybe knight takes e2. A small detail was the idea of his preparation. Just an idea, not giving white a massive advantage or something, but it's a little bit different. White might accelerate, his knight towards black's king side via h5 or d5. The knight's going to f4 right away. He's still going to play c3, but his knight seems to get near black's king a little faster than normal. So that was something we speculated was one of the ideas behind rook e2. However, Sergey responded with b6. That's not normally played in this opening. However, neither is rook e2. Now Magnus played rook e1. So what's the difference? He provoked b6. Is b6 going to be a plus or a minus for black? It's not such a committal move. But there could be something on. Now this diagonal has opened up. That's the main difference I see. He played rook e8, and one variation that shows the benefit of provoking b6 is after bishop f4, which is what Magnus he didn't want to give up the e-file for free, he can afford bishop f4 because rook e1, queen e1, which is what happened in the game, stops this bishop takes d4 idea, as white can reply bishop takes d6. If c takes d6, queen e4, forking the rook and the bishop, let's say bishop takes b2, queen takes a8, bishop takes a1, and bishop a6, and white just wins a piece and has a winning position because of that pinned bishop. The other alternative here, let's say just bishop takes b2, well, bishop takes c7, we have this back rank mate idea on e8. Let's just say queen f8, stopping it, the only square. Knight d2 and 2 pieces for the rook is also a significant advantage. So this queen e4 move allows white to ignore, defense of this pawn, which is a plus. Now you can assume the e-file. So that was maybe the first point where it's like, yeah, provoking b6. I see why it makes some sense. Still, if Karjakin doesn't blunder that, a fairly balanced position. He plays queen e7. More pieces, just trading off more pieces. Carlsen reacts with knight c3. Bishop b7. Note that this knight doesn't have too many squares that it can go to because c7 is not defended. So bishop b7, controlling the d5 square. Now Magnus plays queen takes e7. Why trade the queens? Well, I mean, normally speaking, you might want to keep the queens on the board as white if you don't feel like the endgame yields you enough of an advantage. But the problem is that when you play queen d2, hoping to play rook e1, black plays rook e8, and you don't want to risk actually becoming worse as white. Black has the e-file, and it's not clear how white can contest that anymore after rook e8. And then you risk, just giving black too much activity. He's got some very decent pieces in this position. So Magnus wasn't a fan of keeping, he would have liked to keep the queens on the board, but it would be sacrificing too much in the position. So queen takes e7, bishop takes e7, and now a4. a4 is a very, very reasonable move. There were some pretty decent alternatives as well. The very natural rook e1 is quite playable. First of all, black's not going to react like this. This after bishop takes d6, c takes d6 is just going to lose very quickly or shed some material. This pawn structure is very bad in the long run. We got knight takes d6 or even knight c7 and some variations here. Black's trying to avoid those double pawns. So I was expecting, let's say, bishop f8. And now something like bishop d3. And just with a game to play. But I thought white is going to play f3, king f2. And just this knight is a little bit awkward. Case in point, let's say rook e8. This would be a situation, well, actually rook e8 shows the discomfort for black here. I can actually just take knight takes e8 and play knight b5, and c7 and a7 are both hanging. So rook e8 might not even be playable right away, probably a6 first. And then, for example, I just want to show f3. Why f3? I want to bring my king closer to the center and also control e4. After rook e8 now, play rook d1. This was my recommendation. I'm not sure it was better, but it certainly looked interesting. I was liking this position for white because I really like how f3 stifles this bishop on b7, and white is preparing to bring the king into the center and then start to slowly improve the position. Just some moves, just to make some moves here. Let's say h6, king f2, and I want to play g4, I want to play h4, but this knight, I just don't like this knight for black, and as a result, I think white here can slowly improve his position, maybe bring this knight over, reinforce his center, bring the knight over to g3. It seems like white can improve his position easier than black. So this seemed like a very reasonable alternative. But what Magnus ended up playing makes a lot of sense too. a4, maybe with the idea of a5, maybe with the idea of knight b5 and using that rook on a1 Just example, king f8, knight b5. Let's say we have some structure like this. Yes, we've traded off even more, but this position is certainly favoring white. He has the open a file, and that rook is always going to be stuck on defending a7 because you're unable to play a6 and just get rid of that weakness. So a4 had its own venom. Karjakin naturally avoided that. He played a6. Now g3. g3 is a very, very safe and simple move. The other moves that might come to mind, bishop d3, rook e1, all okay, but g3 is what Magnus decided was to his preference, and it's also just as good. You know, it's one of those. It's the third game of the match, and we're seeing a bit of a trend. I mean, we've had very quiet positions without significant tension, and what that means is, in any given position, in a lot of these positions, there's actually 2 or 3 playable moves, and it's not necessarily the case where one move is better than the others. It comes down to taste or preference in some of these positions. So Magnus played g3, and he has a simple idea of maybe playing bishop h3, or maybe even playing bishop g2, trying to trade off the light squared bishops. But the reason why he doesn't mind that trade is he wants to gain control over the d5 square for his knight. Because right now his knight on c3 can't go to b5, can't go to e4, can't go to d5. He wants to improve that piece. And if it's on d5, it really does cover a lot of squares. g5 was a very bold move by Karjakin, but it wins some valuable time and causes some disruption in the position. First of all, if this bishop moves off the diagonal, I think Black is already happy with the result of this. I was talking about how unpleasant it is that the knight on d6 is blocks its own pawn on d7, and it also, it's pinned. c7 is hanging on some lines. Bishop b3 would just be putting the bishop into a more passive square. Let's say knight f5, even in this position, and the more, let's say, forward bishop e5 runs into f6, and one way or another, you have to give up that bishop. Now this was playable, but yeah, this is why g5 forces things. It forces white to decide what to do with that bishop. Otherwise, this bishop is just really well placed on f4. So g5 forcing the issue, clarifying the position. Magnus plays the simplest continuation. Yes, trades off more, but he thought he could play on for absolutely no risk in this position. Bishop d6, and bishop g2. Very, very, very simple chess. Getting rid of Black's bishop pair. And now we have this endgame rook and bishop against rook and knight, 7 pawns apiece. Black has his g5 move. Time will tell if that's actually a plus or a minus. We've also got some movement on the queen side, a6, b6, and a4. But Magnus evaluated this as, look, it's a position where my knight can hop around quite a bit, whereas this bishop on d6, the position is not open enough. There aren't enough targets for that bishop to really be comfortable or considered a strong piece. So certainly Magnus, true to his style, transitioning into what I consider a very low risk, slightly preferable position where it's just very technical. So, I mean, the sorts of positions where he excels at, where he just slowly grinds away. f5, the first move, very key. Why? Because if you play something slow as Black, I'm going to give an example. Let's just say c6, trying to stop the knight from going to d5. You do have to worry about moves like knight e4, forking the bishop and the pawn, bishop e7, and g4. And the idea of g4 is the knight wants to go to g3 and assume this very pleasant f5 outpost, which will be untouchable for the rest of the game since it is on a light square after all, and Black only has a dark squared bishop. This would be making the g5 pawn look like quite a weakening move. I mean, permanently giving up f5, for example, just to show you how this would look. It wouldn't look pretty. You put the knight to f5, it's reinforced. you can always reinforce it, bring your king in, but that knight on f5 is very strong. It restricts black's king. It can always dive into black's queen side. That would be an advantage for white. So Karjakin played a very, very precise and necessary move, f5. You cannot let that knight get any sort of solid footing. Well, knight d5 now is the only square for that knight to go. King f7. And now knight e3. Another alternative here, but not as flexible, and in the style of Magnus, it was predictable that he wouldn't go for this move, but to me it looked interesting, was c4. And my reasoning for c4 was just to show you, let's say that black passes with h6, I want to play a5. And my idea of a5 is, look, I'm either going to open up the a file for my rook if you let me capture, or if you try to play b5, okay, first of all, this gives me a passed pawn if I decide to take, but otherwise I can play the c5 move, and you have to watch out, c7 is hanging. But otherwise, if I'm just gaining the c file, if I'm just gaining the a file, that's a big plus for me. So c4 has a threat of maybe playing a5, undermining b6, or even playing c5, and trying to get this bishop off of protecting c7. King f7, but Magnus went knight e3, trying to soften up the f5 square. I mean, what white wants to do is keep his pawns flexible and make as many weaknesses in black's position as possible before deciding to take more drastic action, meaning calculate or go for long variations. Right now, he's just maneuvering around and playing quite intuitively. There's not a lot of calculation involved in these lines. It's just white using that knight, which has a bit more mobility than the bishop, to try to provoke black into softening up some squares, especially the light squares. Because once you soften up the light squares, you'll almost never regain them as black. So that's why Karjakin plays king f6 instead of something like f4, which would potentially allow, once again, knight f5. Let's just say knight f5, bishop f8. You can allow this as black, but it's probably not recommended. Probably not recommended. That knight on f5 is really well placed. So king f6, knight c4, bishop f8. Black doesn't want to allow double pawns unnecessarily. Rook e1, assuming the e file. Finally, after first placing the knight onto c4, which is a very nice square, first of all. When the knight's on c3, it kind of blocks your own pawn. You can always reinforce your center with c3 here, and the knight here has two attractive squares, e3 and e5. Sergey played rook d8, and just visually, if we look at the position before and we look at it now, it looks like white's made a little bit of progress. He's won the e file. His knight seems to be in a better square, and black doesn't really have an active plan. That's the main issue here. It's just easier to play for white. Not necessarily much better, but it seems to be easier to play with that knight than with that bishop, where it's not clear, do I put it on g7, do I leave it here? That knight, one thing white wants to keep in mind is he probably wants to keep the knight on the board right now. If you go into a rook endgame, there aren't enough weaknesses for white to claim any sort of serious advantage in a rook endgame. So white's looking to keep that knight on the board until he wins something a bit more meaningful. f4, a very nice move by Magnus. He could have played anything else, and it's okay, it doesn't change the position much. f4 is a bit more drastic, but I believe here he started seeing variations where the f5 pawn that black has becomes a serious target. A very, very serious target. For example, after f4, black has to make a choice. Do I take on f4 or do I play g4? And the downside of the move like g4 is white has the idea of playing this h3 move. And why is h3 kind of significant? Well, white wants to take on g4 and now have two files that he can put his rook on. And it's not really clear how, black's going to stop that. You'd probably have to recapture like with the h pawn. Then I can put my rook here. The variation we looked at might be, let's say, rook e8, king here, and I want to play knight e3 and rook h5 or rook h8. It really depends where you put your pieces, but f5 seems to be the weakest pawn on the board for either color. And examples like, let's say king g6, stopping rook h5, rook h8, that's annoying. Let's kick your king out. Let's kick your rook out, sorry. Rook h5 though, and no matter what, I have this check. King moves, knight e3. And if the knight and rook put pressure on f5, black doesn't really have the pieces to defend that, since it is a light square after all. So these would be positions where black is starting. Once black loses that f5 pawn, everything collapses. So that caused the Karjakin to take a serious think here after g4, because yeah, h3. If you take, well, now you've compromised your structure. You have two isolated pawns. So a very serious choice. Sergey played sort of according to general principles. When you have the bishop, you do want to create more targets and open things up. You don't want to have a close position with the bishop playing against your opponent's knight, usually. So g takes f4, g f4. And now this was a very critical position. Sergey opted for b5 here, opening up maybe another file after ab5. But the reason he went for this is because the alternatives just aren't very good. White has a strong plan here. Let me see if I can show that. I'm just going to play a5. What's White's plan? I want to play knight e3, and I want to get my rook to g5. So king f3, rook here, and just try to compete for that square. So let's say bishop h6, king f3. And this is a sort of annoying position where it looks like both sides have weak pawns, but somehow the f5 pawn is the one that gets targeted first. Black just doesn't really have a move to play here. Rook e8 runs into knight d5 check. So let's say d5 for the sake of it. Okay, I'm going to play rook g1, c6. I still can't move my rook to g5. Rook g3. And I just want to play rook h3 next move and play rook h5. I'm not even necessarily targeting h7. Meaning if you play something like rook d7, I play rook h3. It's just a plan that's very hard to stop. King g6. And now knight takes f5. The bishop is hanging there. It's a quiet position, but yet it seems like it's a very strong plan for White. I mean, rook g1, rook g3, rook h3, and getting to that h5 square. At some point, f5 becomes a serious target in these lines. So the position here required. Black decided to force things. He played b5 because if you just sit back, yeah, White is gonna park his knight on e3, put his king on f3, and eventually try to get his rook anywhere on the board where it can attack f5. Black is just a sitting duck until then. That bishop doesn't have any solid footing on h6 or d6 or f8. So he goes for b5 to try to open up the position more. ab5, knight e3 as expected. c6. A move like d5 is just putting too many pawns on squares where White can attack. Let's just say rook a1, I just want to assume the open file. c6, rook a6. Now you got to play rook d6. Now knight d5 is not a threat. But just a position like king f3, this is just too passive. If I'm White, I might just be playing c3 in this position and just slowly maneuvering my knight into a good square. But all of Black's pawns are going to be targets here. It's a close position that's really favoring the knight, which can wiggle in all the juicy squares, e5, c5. It's just a position where you're giving Magnus way too much time to find the optimal places for his pieces, which you know he's going to do. So a move like d5 is already a big mistake. So, but Sergey, by the way, is playing. He's been outplayed a little bit here, but now c6 is the start of a pretty good plan. I mean, he hasn't he's only made maybe 1 or 2 inaccuracies this game, but now it's time where okay, black is definitely a little bit worse than white by this stage, and if he makes another inaccuracy, things are going to go downhill pretty fast. King to f3, rook a8. Why not rook a1? Well, without playing d5, it's not quite the same. It is not quite the same. So one thing I was considering is, what if I played bishop h6, king here, and now rook e4, rook e8 with the idea of rook e4. I was thinking that this was promising for black, I mean, to try to equalize during the commentary, but it came to my mind afterwards that I still like this for white. After a move like rook a7, you want to play rook here. But this knight g4 move is really annoying. Knight g4 check, that pawn cannot capture, but then white's just picking off the bishop and picking off the pawn on d7, and he'll be up a full pawn in that rook endgame. So this knight on e3, king on f3, king on f6. If black doesn't have this rook e4 counterplay, he's also not a sitting duck in that position, and he's gonna have to just dig in and defend. So at this point, Magnus has a few good options, but what he does is very clever. He actually gives Sergey the a file. He plays king f3, and we're gonna see why he decided to not take the a file. He could have done it, and it would have been playable. But king f3, Sergey plays rook a8. Remember, you always have to keep in mind that rook e8 runs into knight d5 check. King f7, defending the rook, capture, knight f6 check, and that's a nasty fork. So rook a8, and now rook g1. And what white wants is for black to use that a file. That's precisely what Magnus was baiting, and that's exactly what Sergey went into. We were looking at this position, and I was even saying, well, rook a2 was played. You can play a move like bishop h6 first if you want to stop rook g5. And I was saying that I actually want to bait black into placing his rook on some good squares. So let's say rook g3, rook a2, and now just to show, for example, rook g8. So white burned a move just to provoke black to win his own pawn, one of white's pawns. In a position like this, let's say rook d8, white is temporarily down a pawn, but once he picks up one pawn, they're all going to fall. For example, king e7, rook h8, the h7 pawn is falling, f7 is hanging. But when he takes here, then h7, like everything is hanging for black. Once the d7, once d7 falls, c6 becomes weak, h7, f5, they all come into play. They all come into play as targets for white. Whereas white, right now, white has everything protected. f4, c2, his king is shielded from checks. So there's even that idea, which looked very good, very good for white. The point is, this knight on e3 is way better than the bishop. The knight controls a lot of squares. It also attacks f5, whereas the bishop is just artificially staring down on f4 with no backup. So there's even this position which looked promising. And that's how I was thinking I might treat it. I would just play rook here, and I still have the same idea of rook h3 and trying to go for that. But after rook a2, white is still threatening rook g8. There's no reason to actually give up that pawn. If that knight is so good on e3, just rook g8 is what I wanted to play. But after rook a2, Magnus played b3 because there's no rush. After b3 now, there's two threats in the position. There's rook g5, which is going to win f5, just be a pawn up. Or in the case of black defending this threat, now there's rook g8. So rook a2 was the first serious mistake of the game. That rook needed to cover g8, and that rook on a2 doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't actually win any of white's pawns or cause disruption. Now after rook g8, now this position, yeah, once again, this is exactly what black's trying to avoid. Let's say king here, it doesn't matter. I just go, ring around the rosy. Rook d8. If you move your king here, rook h8. If you defend, right, everything's just collapsing. Knight takes f5. That you can't let that rook go to g8. Sergey recognized that, or recognized that he messed up. At this point, we're on move 31, and he's entering a mild time trouble, nothing serious. But he felt the pressure, and he played c5 because all the alternatives are bad. c5 is a desperate move, but I prefer it over those variations I just showed you where I just clean up as white. I play rook g5 and I win f5, or I play rook g8 and I just pick up the pawns from behind. c5, the point of c5, we're going to see right now, first of all, you don't want to take that and give that bishop just a pin. Magnus plays rook g8. Now the reason Sergey kept his bishop on f8 is for precisely this move. He can play king f7, and now if you play rook h8, good job, you trapped your own rook. We've all done that. But if you play rook back to g1, he's actually just going to repeat. Of course, Magnus is not going to repeat in this position. He's going to just improve, make a slight adjustment to that move order. He's going to play rook g2. So now that this pawn is now protected, also if you ever consider taking on c5, that knight won't be pinned. So after rook g2, black decides to take. You can move your king to f6 now. You could have done that as well. But the problem with this move is d c5, bishop c5, knight takes f5. A very nice point. This part of the game, I was quite impressed with how Magnus was playing. I mean, I wouldn't say I was surprised when he feels like he has advantage. I mean, his conversion skills are almost second to none. So this rook g8, rook g2 finesse, very nice. And now you have knight takes f5, king f5, rook g5 check. The king moves away, and now rook takes c5. White is up a pawn in this rook endgame, plus black has a shattered pawn structure. It would be technically winning. But that's a big difference, because from the starting position, let's go through that variation. That's not possible. You can't play knight takes f5. Your rook on g1 is hanging. So it makes a whole world of difference, that move order, that tweaking in that move order. What else here? Yeah, so this variation, knight takes f5. And this was the position they had on the board. Looks pretty bad for black. He's not down a pawn, but if he loses d4, just without any compensation, then it's just gonna be lost once again because of the pawn structure. You just can't allow this position where white's up a pawn and he has a better pawn structure. That's too much. So Karjakin, I mean, if you try to defend that pawn, you're gonna be allowing my king to play king e4, and I'm gonna be winning that pawn anyways. So he plays d3. Necessary. White captures, but at least the pawns are split now. They're isolated. Rook a1. Rook a3, another alternative here. Not sure how to evaluate it, but I still preferred white after a move like rook b2. I want to play king e4, knight e3, and d4. This sort of structure looks kind of nice. You can't play king e6 right now because of knight d4 check. I'm pretty bad with this mouse, by the way. Knight d4 check. So just to show some variations, I'm going to play here. d4, king e4. This would be a sort of position I'd be aiming for as white. I'm up a pawn. My king is well placed. I can always bring my knight back to e3 so that I always cover d5 so that you can't kick my king out. But in a position like this, white is looking to actually play something like rook g2, maybe giving up his b3 pawn, but he's going to get to penetrate on g7, and with his king protecting the knight, he starts to have ideas of maybe setting up a mating net against black's king. But even in this position, the point is white is going to remain a pawn up no matter what, unless he decides to give it up. He's got a sort of position where he's the only one who can improve. So black is down a pawn. That's what happened in the game. He played rook a1. No matter what, black's down a pawn. So now it's sort of the technical phase. I wouldn't say this position is dead lost for black. The benefit for him is we do finally have more of an open position, and white has 4 isolated pawns. Black has 3 isolated pawns. White has 4 isolated pawns. So both sides are similar in that regard, but that sort of landscape should give black a little bit of hope, you know, especially if we take this position and you take the minor pieces off the board, meaning white's knight and black's bishop, this rook endgame would very likely be drawn. All the pawns would black would just harass moves like rook b1, and there's a much higher drawing chance with the minor pieces off the board. So he has some hope. And let's see what happened now. Knight to d4. b4, just protecting that pawn. Some other moves were very reasonable as well. King e4, it's debatable. Maybe this was preferred. But after king e4, I'm going to play rook b1, knight d4, bishop g7. And I'm not sure, well, actually bishop g7 here, knight takes b5, rook here, check. Looks like king f8. This also looks good for white, just because the king is so well placed. Maybe I play knight f5 here, and something like d4. Maybe something like this. This is all playable. There was nothing in the position that we had on the board. There is actually no one move that's far superior to other ones. White's task of converting this position isn't obvious. It's not obvious what you're trying to do. I mean, if you win a second pawn, sure, you're winning, and that's what Magnus kind of tried to do. But besides that, it's not entirely clear what white's best option was. Magnus went for knight d4, b4, rook g5, taking the fifth. And well, there's a lot of options: rook f5, rook b5, a lot of options there. One thing to consider is if black decides to just start checking now, he's not necessarily benefiting himself. White's king is, I'm very happy to put my king here. If you play rook d1, I'm actually going to play rook g3. And I'm just going to protect everything. So for example, rook here, I'm going to play knight f3. And now everything is protected. I'm maybe going to play d4. Maybe going to play rook here. I got some checks available, knight g5, knight e5. But there's no like forced way to somehow win a pawn. And you don't want to run the risk of improving white's coordination or white's piece activity. So instead of checking white's king and allowing white to get the king, in the center, he played rook b1. What's the idea of rook b1? Well, it's quite simple. He's ready to play bishop g7, hitting the knight, and then hopefully b3 falls. Rook f5 check. King e8. Rook to b5. Now this sets up that if you play bishop g7, I have the very nice rook b8 check. First of all, if king here, check, king moves, take, rook takes b4, that's 2 pawns up. That's a win for white. But the point there is after king f7, rook b4, bishop takes d4, rook takes d4, d7 is now hanging with check. That's 2 pawns up. So this rook b5 has a point to it. However, to nobody's surprise, hopefully, Karjakin didn't blunder that. He played rook f1 check. King e4, rook e1 check, king f5. The king could have gone to d5. With the rook on b5, now I don't have those same ideas, so I might have been concerned about rook f1. And after f5, maybe even like rook f2. This is a bit concerning. I might be overplaying my cards here. So Magnus goes for king f5. Okay, he's not going to repeat moves. And of course, if you just try to go for this, once again, it's not clear that there's no forced way for... Actually, yeah, I don't think there's a forced way for black to win any pawns, although there are some lines that need to be calculated, like rook b1. It is very scary though. I don't think Karjakin wanted to go for this. I mean, Magnus did play king f5 allowing this, because you might have some options, such as rook d7, rook b7, rook b3, knight e5. And these sort of positions where white gives up a pawn temporarily, but all his pieces are so advanced that black might be, you know, signing his death wish by going pawn hunting like that. Let's say d6, just to show a sample variation, king e6, and just to threaten checkmate on b8. The knight, the king, all of white's pieces are right in the position, getting ready to deliver mate while the rook is on b3 and the bishop is on f8. So there's a bit of risk to play like that. Instead, Sergey played closer to the center with rook d1. Very good move, because those variations I just showed are just not possible. The d3 pawn is worth more than the b3 pawn in those lines. So rook e5 check, king f7, rook d5. And we were this whole variation, we were a bit surprised to see it, because the way I was evaluating this, I was like, if I'm white, I don't want to necessarily trade one for one. I mean, I feel like black's pawns are for the, you know, are somehow weaker than white's. I mean, every pawn that gets traded off, in some ways, we move closer to a draw, especially if, speaking about this position, if you take away the d7 and b4 pawn for black, and you take away the b3 and, I don't know, and d3 pawn for white, white retains an extra pawn, but they're all on the same side. That's closer to a draw. That's not theoretically winning, as far as I can tell. You want to keep an imbalance. If you want an extra pawn, if you're up an extra pawn, you want that pawn to be on the queen side. You want to stretch the position out. All on the same side, every pawn that gets traded off, it's a little bit closer to a draw in most cases. So we weren't necessarily happy with this, but very tough to make some choices. There were ways. I mean, Magnus could try to keep the pawns on the board, but Karjakin was really playing very accurately here, never allowing sort of bind in the position. White was never comfortable to just get a free hand and improve his pieces. So after rook d1, rook e5 check, king f7, rook d5. I mean, the problem is, once again, if you play rook e3, I play rook b1, and I'm going to play bishop g7. And after bishop g7, what's stopping black from taking the knight and taking b3 and getting too much counterplay? Tough. Not easy at all. So rook d5, rook takes d3, rook takes d7 check, king e8. I mean, that's pretty much the only move you want to make. Anything else is going to be met by probably here, let's say king e4, and I'm either going to pin your bishop, or in the case of rook f3, I'm going to play rook h2, I'm going to play knight f3, and your rook is a bit out of play here. So king e8 is with tempo, rook d5, and rook h3. Now, once again, want to stress out that despite being up a pawn, Karjakin is really playing incredibly well. Like, his defense here is as tenacious as I've ever seen in my life. He's been playing the top move or close to the top move for a series of moves now. I mean, white never was comfortable enough to get a sort of position where Magnus sensed that he was winning. He's just never gotten into that comfort zone in this position. The rook play by black has been extremely accurate. So rook h3, obviously still hitting b3 and hitting h2. But Magnus had this under control. Rook e5 check. King f7, rook e2. That was the only way to defend the pawn, so not a lot needs to be said there. Bishop g7. This has been a long time coming. Black's always wanted to put pressure on b3 and then add his bishop into the fray to get rid of that defender, that knight defending, that centralized knight, which not only defends b3, but has so many squares it can go to. After bishop g7, knight c6. Magnus had anticipated that. Both guys had kind of seen this. And knight c6 is a very, very tricky move. Some of us mortals like myself might have been very tempted to play rook takes b3. However, you're going to regret that very quickly because knight d8 check. I think I showed some variations here. How did this go? Well, first of all, if you go king g8 after rook g2, knight e6 is very, very dangerous. Sorry, what am I saying? Rook e8 check, bishop f8, knight e6 leads to checkmate. And if king here, check, you can't play king here because of rook g2. The knight just does some jumps around until black is lost. Knight g5 check, king g8, rook check, bishop f8, knight e6, same thing. Otherwise, if king here, I'm going to check and play king g6, and also just checkmate black. It's very nice that there's no checks from behind, and now rook e8 is mate. So the knight goes to d8 and then to e6, and then it's over. So there were some serious threats there, and all that is partly because the king is on f5. It's about as good as it gets. That king on f5 is going to turn into an attacking piece. So Karjakin doesn't go for that variation. Obviously, he plays rook h5 check. Go back. King e4 was also an alternative here. But he didn't want to block the e-file for those variations. So now after rook c5, knight d8, king g6. Once again, don't fall for this tactic. King g6 played, only move. Now knight e6. h5, a very, very, very necessary move. One line we looked at. Let's say you play rook c3. You just can't allow, well, what the common theme is in some of these lines, you just can't allow white's king to stay so active. I play, let's say, f5 check. King here. Knight g5, threatening mate. Let's say you go h5 check so that you can kick my king out. I just play king f4, still threatening mate on e6, and if not mate, I mean I'm also threatening knight e4. Everything is happening, and you're just not in time to somehow kick my pieces back. So you can't allow the king to be on f5, and you can't allow the king to be on g4, and Karjakin recognized that right away. There's all these nasty mating nets that get involved, or especially he's playing practical chess. He doesn't have a ton of time. These lines, there's so much to calculate if you're allowing white's king to help out in the attack. He plays h5. King has to go to the third. King f3. Rook c3 check. King e4. Also rook e3 is possible. The pawn endgame is not something black's excited to go for. He is down a pawn, and there should be a way, white should be winning there. Should be a way to kick, to slowly use that f-pawn and win. But it kind of transposes. So king e4. Now we're threatening rook g2 check. bishop f6. A move, now bishop f6 may not have been the most precise. I believe king f6 was. But the detail here that you need to know is I'm always looking as white to give up my b3 pawn. I'm not going to stay defending that pawn the whole game. It's not, I can't make progress and defend that pawn. So as white, I was really trying to, I want to give up that pawn. For example, to play f5, my king is centralized, my knight is really good, my pawn is good, and after rook takes b3, to play something like rook g2. This is what a lot of the positions come down to. White is going to give up the pawn at some point, distract that rook, and deliver a very serious attack. This would be an example of that. Now the bishop is hanging, rook g6 check is happening. Actually, you can't move the bishop anywhere. That's the point. You're just lost. You can't move it anywhere. But rook g6, I mean, everything, the pieces coordinate so well for white. The problem with this position is black is not going to be greedy. He's going to play bishop h6, and we don't have time to play to proceed. I just want to play this, but you have rook e3, and then f5 is falling. So Magnus was looking for ways to make life easier. I mean, you have to play practically. He's not going to defend b3 the entire game. But this bishop h6 move is critical. And after bishop h6, I think black is okay. I mean, just even doing the highlight is tiring, because these guys, every single move, you have to, one detail or another, one new move, every single position, they might be similar, but they're not the same. And these guys have to factor for that the entire game. So that was something that Karjakin could have done. Okay, once again, I just want to reiterate, trading off the minor pieces is not beneficial for white. Let's just say h3, king f6. I don't think this rook endgame, yeah, I mean, this rook endgame, you need to make sure you win the b4 pawn, but you can't win it unless you commit your rook to attacking it, and whenever that happens, I'm going to play rook c3, hitting these two pawns. So king e4, threatening rook g2, and now bishop f6. Now Magnus has a chance. He plays, first of all, he plays rook e3 here. f5 check was possible, although what we see is after king f7, white has no more checks. And I really like, you know, that knight is supposed to cause some chaos, but the bishop on f6 really defends that nicely, stops g5, stops d8, stops all the checks. Especially when you're in time trouble, it's very hard to account for all the checks, but here, easy. There are no checks. On g7 anywhere. Rook e3 first though, trying to gain maybe a valuable tempo. The threat of going into a winning endgame. Karjakin plays h4. Sorry, it's not a winning endgame yet. The threat's not there because take king d3. There is king to f5, hitting the knight and hitting f4. It's not a winning endgame. Not yet. First he plays h3, and now rook c1. At a certain point, white will be ready to take that rook. So rook c1. One important point is you do want to play h3 as white in some of these lines. Otherwise, there could be some positions where black plays h3 himself and fixes this h2 pawn on a dark square. So h3, rook c1. And now Magnus embarks on another knight journey, but there's nothing extremely obvious. Once again, I mean, f5 is begging to be played. I play king f7. And I'm not exactly sure how to proceed. I'm really not sure how to proceed. Because the problem is, you go here, I check. Where do I put my king? If I go here, you play rook e5. If I put my king here, well, you're just going to keep checking me from behind. Check. It's not clear. Those are a lot of pawns to defend. h3. b3, f5, they all need to be considered. He plays knight f8 check. king f7, knight d7, and no, the idea of moving the knight there isn't to take the bishop, it's to go somewhere else. It's maybe to go to d5 or to c4, a couple light squares. King e6, precise once again. There's actually a very serious threat of king f5 too. The knight on d7 covers the rook c5 check, and if the king infiltrates on f5, that's gonna be lights out. So king f5 was a threat here. He plays king e6, forcing the knight to b6. Now rook d1, another really precise move. If you don't play rook d1, then I really will consider knight d5 and f5, or even I can move my king and get a discover check, and that's always nice to move your king and check your opponent. So he plays rook d1, and you can't really play knight d5, right, because of rook d4. So now Magnus plays f5. f5 is a committal move. He didn't want to play f5, but Sergey was defending well. The point of f5 is he was trying to provoke something. He was trying to provoke Sergey into moving the king to the other side of the board. So for example, if you move your king there, I may just switch gears and play king f3, and now you've committed your king onto, let's say, the queen side. You know, a move like here, I can check, move your king back, or actually I don't even know where, move my knight back to c4, and your king is now cut off from the king side. So that would change the position. That would certainly shift the evaluation a little bit in favor of Magnus if his f pawn isn't contested by black's king. But Sergey, very cool, just plays his king to f7. That's the battle. That's where the battle is. You still can't play a knight d5 because of rook d4 check. So after knight c4, by the way, just for those wondering, rook d3, again, black's not going to go into a minor piece endgame. He's just going to check. And you can't move your king to d5 because of rook e5 check, but then the checks are just coming from behind. So knight c4, rook d4 check, king f3, kicking the king back, and now a critical point in the game. This is move 61. So now they hit the first time control at move 40. They hit the second time control at move 60. So now for example, Karjakin had 15 minutes for the rest of the game. There's no more extra time added besides the standard 30 seconds per move. Now it's crunch time, and he finally made a serious inaccuracy in my mind, right when he was close to just having the draw. King g7 was a move we looked at, and what am I planning as black? Just to walk my king in and pick off f5. Not easy at all to suggest how white deals with this. Because of rook here, I'm just going to check. And you probably have to move your rook back because b3 is hanging. King h6, king g5. The knight right now on c4, it looks nice, but I want the knight on e4, and it can't get to e4. It can't go to d6 or d2. But then what's stopping black from just moving his king to g5? I'm not sure. I think that is extremely close to a draw, if not a draw. Playing king g7 here and passing. But Sergey played bishop to g5, allowing rook e4. Again, you can't trade rooks, but of course you're going to play rook d3 check. King g4. So b3 is hanging, but the bishop is hanging. You have to take care of that first. Rook g3 check, king h5. Still, the bishop is hanging. He played bishop to e7. But in this position, once the rook has vacated the d file, the knight starts to get a bit excited. It starts to see that it can play knight d6 or knight e5. And white with his king on h5, sure, might be no longer defending its pawns, but you start to sense or smell some checkmating nets, some patterns are starting to creep up. For example, after king h5, he played bishop e7, let's say bishop f6, you start seeing moves like check. here, what's the move here? You start seeing some mating nets, you know, something like this. Rook e8 submit. Things start to get quite dicey for black. He might not be in time to pick up any of those pawns because of the mating threats. Karjakin plays bishop e7. You can't stop both of the knight moves. So he plays bishop e7, but that allows knight e5 check. By the way, probably bishop f6 was better, but at this point, Karjakin is down to his last few minutes, his last time control, and it's very hard to just expect him to play perfectly. So bishop f6 might have been playable there, but anyways, bishop e7, knight e5 check. I mean, White's not just gonna move his knight in. He's gonna play rook e6, cutting the king off from any sort of f6 squares or any sort of space, and then he's gonna bring the knight in. But he wants his rook in the inside the position as well. So after bishop e7, knight e5 check, things start looking grim. He played king f6 because if you move your king anywhere else, you can't play here because of check. Can't play king e8 because of the same thing. The bishop would be pinned. And if you go here, I mean, you already have to start to watch out for moves like this. You can't take. That would just be a lost endgame. Maybe you have to put your king right here and hope there's no win. But it's not. I don't have a good feeling about this for black. Besides, there might be knight g4 here, or even knight g6, double attacking that bishop. That king is still very well placed on h5. Might even move forward. I'm not sure. King f6 was played instead. He had to just play intuitively. He felt that was also bad. Knight g4 check. Very nice move by Magnus. King f7. What he was hoping for was that Karjakin would get a bit excited and sense, look, I'm down a pawn, and now my piece is very loose on e7. However, it's a rook. There's a rook and knight and rook and bishop. If the pawns are off the board, if I can trade my bishop for White's pawns, it's still a draw. A rook against a rook and knight is a draw. So there are some variations here that, if they're played incorrectly, black is, rook takes h3. If black can win all of White's pawns, it's a draw. The problem is after king f5, I'm going to check. Right now that forces the king to f4. Now I'm going to capture. How does it go? And after rook takes h3, there's this rook f7 check. This is all very deep, but it was something that they both had to account for. The king can't go to the center because of knight f2 check. And if it goes here, it's kind of boxed its own rook in. And maybe now White can even consider just going after that pawn. He'll be up a full knight. He should be a winning endgame as long as he retains that b3 pawn. So that's the difference. And if you take here, there's king takes h4. And White's just going to maybe put his rook behind, and slowly but surely, eventually he's just going to find a way to push this pawn, but he doesn't need to do it yet. As long as it's protected, no problem. So Karjakin didn't fall for that, even despite having very little time. That just this rook e5 move is very critical, forcing the king to go to f4. Instead, he played king f7, rook e6. Why rook e6? In the same variation, the king can't go back to f6. You're preparing knight e5. So you went rook takes e3. Again, I mean, both of the pawns are hanging, but knight e5 check is winning a piece. So what Karjakin is trying to account for is, I'm going to lose a piece, but I just need to make sure that I get all of White's pawns for that. So rook takes h3 does a good job of that. If rook takes b3, knight e5 check. You can't go king here. You can't go king here. Both of those run into knight g6. That's the issue. No, the issue is if you take rook takes b3, knight e5, you play check, king g7, check, king here. Try to remember, this might also be a draw as well. It's a very similar idea that black plays this king f6 move, and it's very hard for white to defend all of those pawns. Huh. What's the difference with... Karjakin did rook takes h3, which is what I believe to be more accurate. Maybe this variation is working as well. There's so many variations that at a certain point you just get confused. What's the difference between one or the other? Knight c6. And the point is, after rook takes h3, king g4, white's winning. He's retaining a pawn. That's all that I care about. Rook check, king here. And I'm going to play rook e6 check next move. And then my knight's going to come in. So rook takes h3, after rook takes b3 allows this king g4 move. And then rook e6 check is going to push the king back, and then you play knight e5, and white retains that pawn, then it's winning. So Karjakin holding up, still calculating accurately, in the 6th hour of play, by the way, this was past 6 hours, he did rook takes h3 first. And now, of course, you know, that line I just showed isn't quite in play yet. Knight e5. Knight h6 check, guys, just so you know, yes, I'm not going to play this move because now I'm not winning f5 and white's up a pawn and I'm just winning. But the problem with knight h6 is king here. f6. What else? I'm going to take rook takes, king e8, and there's no way to stop rook takes b3. You lose your pawns. That's just an easy draw. Rook against rook and knight. So, instead, you have to play knight e5 as the check. Sergey playing king g7. Rook takes e7 check. And king f6. So he gives up a full piece. He could have gotten a pawn for it, but not in a good way. But now after king f6, white has to play something he doesn't want to play. Knight c6 drives the knight away from such a strong central square. Rook e6 check just gives tempo. Rook and knight are still hanging, and the pawn. Well, you can't play rook f7 check because the knight is hanging. Move like this, I guess I can just take here. Check, king here. Can't defend b3. So Magnus was calculating, knight c6. The only, I mean, he played knight c6 here. What is it setting up? It's setting up a win, only if Sergey blunders. And what is that blunder? Well, it didn't happen in the game. Sorry to disappoint you guys. Fortunately for Magnus, rook takes b3. You have rook e6 check. If you don't take the pawn, well, I've already spoken about that. If white retains the pawn, he should be winning. King takes f5, knight d4 check. And it forces your king to move anywhere off of that rook, and then white just picks up the rook. So rook b3, no. There's two other moves then. The move that Karjakin probably should have played was rook c3. Instead, he played king takes f5. The problem with king takes f5, I'm not going to go too deep into this. Actually, wait, that happened, so I will go too deep in that. Rook c3 was really annoying. Because after this move, rook e6 check, king takes f5, knight d4 check, king f4. Yes, white is holding on to the pawn right now. Let's just say I pick this guy up. The problem is black's king is so active and his rook is so active that he doesn't have enough pieces to hold that knight on d4. So rook d3, for example, rook d6, king e4. That knight has to move, then b3 falls. Some sort of check doesn't make a difference. Actually, I should put my king here. Trying to figure out I'm not making blunders here. Maybe I am. I mean, even the analysis is telling me this is such an epic game. Yeah. Yeah, the knight has the outpost that you'd like your knight to be on is a5, where it defends b3 and it's not really easy for black's king to access. But in these lines, it's getting booted out continuously. Yeah, for example, knight e2, king here. Yes, I'm not threatening to take the pawn because of knight d4, but let's just say I make a king move out of the way. I play king f2. Yeah, I play king f2, and there's no way to defend that pawn on b3. I know this is very deep, but this was something that could have happened, and that would have drawn the game by force. Rook c3 right here there's no way for white to win. There's no way for white to keep that pawn. His king is too far away. Black's king and rook chase that knight away until the pawn on b3 falls. But Karjakin, right when he had, once again, that's twice. So everyone's human. He was very close to draw earlier, and then that's when he made a bit of a mistake. And now he played king takes f5, allowing rook to e1. Rook e1. What can I say? Magnus didn't play this, and we thought he'd play it for sure. We thought one more blunder by Sergey, and Magnus isn't going to let him off the hook this time. Rook e1, very important. Not only does it stop black from generating counterplay where he puts the rook around and he pushes his pass pawn, but again, you can't take here. There's a huge difference though. Rook check, I have knight d4. I mean rook c3, I have knight d4. And with a rook on e1, black's king is forced into areas he doesn't want to be. Here, I have check. Well, if I don't go there, then I have to go king f6. Then this is game over. King takes h4, rook d3. There's a big difference with the king here or the king here. Why? I play rook e4. The king can never enter that box where the knight is, and all these squares are permanently covered. So all white does, his knight is safe. His knight is safe, and he just brings his king in. So a huge difference. Magnus could have played rook e1, and that would have been winning. There is no way for for black to win that pawn by force, and there's no way he's going to queen this by force. So, I mean, maybe he can try to fight on. He can play moves like this. But again, there's been a couple ideas I've said. You can also play knight a5, and that defends the pawn. And it's very hard to harass that knight on a5. So maybe king f4 would have been something. But rook e1, without a doubt, that was the move Magnus had to play. I believe it's winning. And if he had played that move, the following moves, he's probably going to find. It certainly makes black's task much harder. Keep in mind, Karjakin was down to just a few minutes. So rook e1, really surprised, fatigue or something happened. We're all human. But rook e1 was like a clear win for Magnus. He could have taken a commanding lead. I mean, after 3 games, any win is big in such a technical match. But instead, he plays Knight a5. So the players trade off blunders, right, when they both could have either achieved the draw that they wanted or the win that they were working 6.5 hours for. Knight a5, the rook goes to h1, and yes, white does retain the pawn right now, but we see in this variation that black keeps his h-pawn. Black's king is still very active, white's knight is out of play, and so what black wants to do is use this pawn and leverage it into distracting black's rook so that he can chase this knight away. So rook b7, rook a1, check. Okay, the knight is hanging, and you don't want to play a move like this and allow h3. Then you might be losing as white because h2 now seems very hard to stop, or at least you're going to be very passive. I mean, it might still be okay here, but let's just say king here. I'm going to give a sample variation. Let's just say white gets this position. He stops h2. Well, black has a plan. I play rook c1. I'm going to chase this knight away. You can't go to a5 because of rook c5 check. Let's say here. Oh, I was going to suggest this move. This is a very common idea to try to draw. That would be a draw. But there is rook h4. So maybe I have to do that a little bit better. And there's also a reason why I'm not playing a world championship match. These positions are very, very difficult. So rook a1, rook b5 check, king f4 happened. But yeah, I mean, no, I mean if knight c4 here, check. Let me solve that. Let me solve that. I don't want to diminish the game. Rook here. What am I missing? Black is supposed to draw, but finding out how is another story. It's very possible that something like rook c1, and you just park the rook on c3. Because if the knight, a5 is the key square for white to win. If the knight's on a square like d2, where it does defend b3, that's not winning. Because in a lot of these lines, I'm going to show, for example, that's not what I'm supposed to do. Let's play king d3. Yeah, there we go. Is that it? It looks something like what I'm referring to. If the knight's not an a5, on d2 it can always just be chased by the king. So something like this is what I'm aiming for. Maybe this is a draw. You're supposed to chase the knight away. Didn't happen in the game because after rook b5 check, king f4, rook takes b4. I mean, if you move your king away, game over. Because again, as long as white keeps that pawn, but the h pawn is a form of counterplay. So black would rather give up the b4 pawn than the h pawn at this point. Well, now these lines don't work at all because there's no check and playing rook f2. So now h2 can't be stopped, and now you're in trouble. So Magnus plays rook takes b4 check, king here. Now the knight is hanging, and h3, h2 is a threat. He plays rook check, king here. Again, he played knight c4 here. If he takes. Black's king is faster. Well, first of all, this is a check. Let's say rook b5. I just bring my king in. and my king is faster into defending that b4 pawn, so that's just a draw. The rook endgame. So he brings the knight in. He's up a pawn, yes. I mean, he's retained that pawn, but we'll see what happens. h3, king here. Rook h4, king g3, threatening h2. And the repeated moves. There's just no way to stop h2. There aren't any checks that you really want to use. For example, knight d2. I still play h2. Check. King here. Knight can't access the squares to defend. I mean, if you check. King f3 doesn't change the result. In fact, if you get really greedy, yeah, you don't want to be really greedy either. So for example, something like this, maybe just rook g1, and I'm looking to even get rid of that knight and queen. So white's playing with fire if he tried to play for a win. There is no win there. There's no way to stop h1 from happening. So instead, Magnus just repeats. I mean, why king g3? You don't want to give that check. You don't want to play king g2 and allow knight e3 check. So Karjakin was just shifting king f2, king g3. And what can I say? It was an 80 move. It was a 79 move draw. Magnus, for the first time in the match, missed a win, and Karjakin had a couple. He showed some weakness in the middle game. He did get outplayed from a pretty equal position. I'm saying pretty equal. Maybe it wasn't entirely equal, but he got outplayed very easily, and he found himself in an inferior position right away. So both players showing a bit of sign of weakness. Magnus has to convert those if he wants to win, and Karjakin cannot allow positions like this to continue through the match, because you know Magnus is going to convert these one of these days. But what can I say? That was almost 7 hours. A really exciting game in my opinion, because the evaluation swung some amazing defense, some pretty cool knight maneuvers, and the endgame was extremely deep. I mean, it takes an analysis video isn't even enough to get into depth in that endgame. So it would take hours to maybe figure out what were some of the missed opportunities, and figure out more into what these players are calculating. But a really epic game. I hope you guys enjoyed Game 3. This was Magnus Carlsen playing white against Sergey Karjakin and missing a chance to take a lead into the match. The first decisive result has yet to happen, and next up, Karjakin is going to get a chance to put pressure on Magnus as he gets the white pieces in round 4. Once again, this was the game review for the World Championship match on Chess 24. I'm Grandmaster Hansen, and I hope you guys enjoyed it.